we are thrilled to have you guys here tonight for this, what's going to be fantastic talk. We'll see. I guarantee it will be great. I spent some time with this gentleman this afternoon in my hiking and walking clothes, and he's fantastic. When Dean reached out about this, I quickly said, absolutely, come do this here. Dean and I have had a lot of talks about overlap with values between our two organizations, none the least being, interest in stewardship, interest in preservation. So that just made sense to us. A couple of quick housekeeping things for anyone who's not been in our building. If you need a restroom during the evening, there are two right through that door across from the welcome desk. There's also a water fountain out there if you get a little parched. It's a little warm in here. We apologize. We still have the furnace on because we're in the weird season where it gets cold at night, but it's apparently very hot out. So I'm going to hand things over to Dean. Before you all head out this evening, Kate, our head of education, has put a few things out on the welcome desk about some upcoming events going on with the Historical Society, so check those things out, and your show.
All right, Jess, thank you very much. Yeah, it's super wonderful to be able to collaborate with organizations in town, and this is a natural fit here between the Litchfield Historical Society and the Litchfield Land Trust. My name is Dean Birdsall, and we had the wonderful pleasure of stomping around in the woodlands today with Robert Thorson, a distinguished professor at the University of Connecticut. One of the things that I think you're going to see right away, we certainly noticed it, is that he is not only incredibly informative and intense with his knowledge about stone walls and geology, but he's incredibly enthusiastic and generous at sharing this information. So Robert Thurston is a Midwestern native turned Northwestern geologist turned Northeastern academic. His recent essays in Smithsonian, How Stone Walls Became a Signature Landform in New England, was cited by the History News Network for its lists, quote, Best History Writing of 2023. As a professor of earth sciences at the University of Connecticut, he commutes to work on a woodland path and across UCONN's Great Lawn, a former pasture. Since publication of Stonewall Secrets in 1998, which is a Smithsonian notable book for children, he's been a stump evangelist for the appreciation, investigation, and conservation of New England's stone walls. As a scholar, he's interested in the interweave between environmental history, literature, and science. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Thorson.
Thank you all for coming here. What a great room and a really nice building and a nice crowd. You can hear the scratch in my voice. I've been talking from 2 o'clock till about 5:30, outdoors, over traffic noise and through leaf noise. So I may switch to the microphone in a little while. Usually I don't. But for those of you that can't hear me, I'll be happy to do it right now. Microphone, you okay with me? Yeah. Okay. This is not Litchfield, it's just a pretty picture just to get us going, okay? What really motivated me is I have published a new paper in February. It's in the Public Historian, it's the journal. It's a vetted journal. I'm getting serious about going to Stonewall conservation through the peer-reviewed vetted literature, okay? And this comes after one here in the Journal of Historical Archaeology, which is 2023. I'm getting really serious about defining and making stone walls a science so that we can begin to treat them the way we do with wetlands, okay? Now, you may not like wetlands, but the policy history is pretty clear. They were worthless, they weren't worth much, people didn't think about much, and then all of a sudden, we started recognizing their hidden values, so instead of draining them, we began to conserve them. And land trusts, of course, are very involved in that. There's a parallel between the wetlands that are conserved by public interest and the dry lands. The dry lands, which are the stone walls. They're the closest thing we have to a desert here. And in fact, they are related because many of the wetlands that we have in New England are the consequences of the land conversion that happens in the last 4 centuries here. Thus, the stone walls are much the same. There's a deep, hidden ecology piece to both of the wetlands and the walls. That is, we're part of the landscape, invested in it, and it reflects us. So, having said that, I want to thank Dean for the lovely introduction, and Jessica for the smiles all afternoon. You know, we just tromped and tromped and tromped and tromped. And this is a dry land. It's a barrier for some organisms. It's a corridor for others. There's a shady side and a windward side, right? There's a windrift side and a leeward side. Okay, there is a corridor and a boundary, and in some places you will see all kinds of ecology on opposite sides of the wall. They really are part of the landscape, not to mention that they're volumes of themselves. So I got kind of a tall order to get through here. Truth in advertising. There was a time, but it wasn't in Litchfield. I've been here at least twice before. I spoke at the White Memorial Forest 10 years ago, I forget. I've been a stump evangelist for many years. And I also spoke at somewhere in one of those buildings, and I think it was the Historical Society years ago. So this is my 3rd trip back to Litchfield to do this. But I have showed up and given the wrong talk, okay? And people are so polite, they never said, I came to hear one thing and you talked about it. So I always like to make sure that this is the truth in advertising, that this is indeed what I'm going to talk about. And I've got an outline. I'm just going to talk about the phenomenon. Now, you know the phenomenon if you're New Englanders. If you've been living around here, you know what it is. Big deal. That's what my wife said. She's raised in New England. You know, big deal. Yeah. What are you obsessed about these things? Well, I moved from Alaska with a PhD in cold soils, glacial geology, archaeology, and all of that. And I walked, and I was hired as a landscape geologist. So the first thing I do is find the nearest state forest and walk a transect. And I'm going up and over these walls. And I go, what are these things? What are they? And of course, my wife said, they're walls, get over it. Get over it, you know. But I couldn't get over it. I had a year-long sabbatical at Dartmouth College, and I was able to dive into it, looking, surely I can find the explanation for this phenomenon. And of course, there's all kinds of explanations. But they're based on oral tradition, they're based on history, they're based on properties, deeds, based on little information here and there. I wanted to know the phenomenon as an emergent phenomenon from human ecology. And so I really got serious about it, and I began looking into it. This is my marker slide. When you see it, it means I'm going to move to the next segment of the talk. And I'm going to talk about the phenomenon, and then I've got a Litchfield slide, a few slides about Litchfield. We're going to talk about that. And then I'm going to get to the main heart of it, talk about why are stone walls the binding threads of our regional cultural fabric. I'm going to say that again. They are the binding threads of our regional cultural fabric, inland from the coast. It's not about lobsters, it's not about lighthouses, it's about places like Litchfield. You know, the rural New England, the 40,000 square miles of inland rural New England that are crisscrossed with probably 200,000 linear lengths of stone walls. I mean, it's just a staggering phenomenon. Way up there with anything else. Now that, I'm going to talk about the threats to stone walls, pretty briefly, and then the origin and history. You know, let's talk about the history of stone walls briefly. And then some of the science, and I'm going to end with the management, and I'm going to try and end on time. But I don't have a watch, and I don't see a thing on, so maybe this one has a clock. Ah, it does. But I got started a little late, so I need to save that time. So this means I'm going to go to the next segment of the slide, the phenomenon. There's the phenomenon. Okay. Is that me, or is it you guys, or what? I don't care. Okay, it's off. The microphone's off. I don't care. I can deal with it. I had enough kids to get, you know. So this is the phenomenon. You can see the end of the pier on the left and the tallest hotel on the right. This is taken by an anonymous photographer in 1880. Wow. And this is really an impressive. And all of them, or almost all of them, are there today. These are glacial features, but they're also What happens in Ireland, right? If you're an island, you stay, you concentrate, you work it down, the trees are gone, it gets more and more intensified. So the closest thing we have to that here is an island, settled by 11 families in the late 17th century or something, and within a year they were burning peat. Within a century, excuse me, within a century they were burning peat because there wasn't anything left to burn, all right? And that's pretty impressive. So that's 1880s, and the phenomenon turned. This is one I took about 10 years ago. It's the same tip of the pier, the same tallest hotel. Do you understand that? So this is what's happened. The oak scrub forest just grew back and it shaded out all those walls. So if we were above the landscape looking down through the trees, we would see the former picture rather than this one. And the same thing happened in Litchfield. The same thing happened where I live in eastern Connecticut. The trees grew back like weeds, you know, because people walked away from the landscapes, often for bad taxes. And not all of it was walked away from, but much of it was. New England was largely abandoned for agriculture until we got wheels, until we had rubber tires on personal automobiles, and then people could go back to the land. So I got some pictures here, and I also put some just framed pictures back there if you want to look at them. They're just pretty pictures of stone walls. But the key idea is that your walls are not all the same here. I've seen a bunch of them. And they're not the same everywhere. All over New England, they look very different. So I just got a gallery of photographs just to show you, with very little comment other than where they were. This is Sherman, Connecticut. Marble and limestone. This is Montauk Point, Long Island, which is part of New England as far as I'm concerned. You know, these are the hardest stones that made it all the way down the glacial flow line and concentrated out there in that sandy glacial moraine. This is a classic block cut. You've heard about the rotting basements or the foundation failures. This is the mineral that's doing it. It's the rusted mineral called pyrrhotite. It's an iron sulfide, right? And it instantly oxidizes and releases sulfuric acid and gypsum, and the walls fall apart. But this is a typical cut granite wall being stained by chemical reactions. And all of those stones look the same color when they were put there. Here's a classic one for easternmost Connecticut on the Rhode Island border. You know, it's just your basic farm stand wall, but the barbed wire is there to remind you that hardly any of these were good fences without something else. This is a rare wall. You know, the Central Valley of Connecticut is a lozenge-shaped Jurassic Rift basin, you know, with soft sedimentary rocks in it and volcanoes and all that stuff. With that red rock, the brownstone from New York City, the Portland quarry rock, all that stuff. This is a stone wall made of it. But it's so rare to get it because it's so soft, right? It's falling apart in the brownstones. Now, well, it falls apart when the glacier gets a hold of it. It just laughs and it crushes it, you know, like a sugar cube. You know, it's that soft. But I've actually found walls made of the brownstone. And here's just an old line Connecticut, you know, just down there on that really hard rock shore. Here's a pattern in Connecticut put together by my colleague. These are stone walls, probably within Litchfield. I wasn't able to source the location, but it's northwestern Connecticut somewhere. So it's probably near here. This is the higgledy-piggledy pattern of individual farmers, right? Settling landscapes and working on the terrain without government constraints. Here's the same thing in central New Hampshire. Now here we've got lot lines laid out and survey lines, and you get a very, very different pattern. But those are all walls. Look at how many of them. If the wall was a hare, right, and the land was a dog, it would be a shaggy dog. That's how much there is. Done. That's a gallery view of just a few stone walls and sort of an introduction to how I got here and what I'm planning to do. So we'll move away from that. I've still got a voice. I'm going to say ahead, I made a new buddy today. Jim, where are you? He's my new buddy. There he is. He sent me this picture. He kind of was a little put off by me. I said, I need the measurements. I need to know the distance between those angles. It's a zigzag wall. This is proof positive, right, that a wooden rail, zigzag Virginia rail fence was there before the stone accumulated, and the stone then replaces the lower, rail or two on the fence as you run out of wood. you'd rather use the stone. And you preserve that zigzag pattern. And today I looked at him, I said, it wasn't a very good photograph, thanks, but it wasn't a very good photograph. And if you know what I mean, it's as good of a photograph as he could get, right? Because it's not that photogenic. You know, it's too low, too gray, not shadowed enough. It's really hard to get a picture of it. But I would like to say that I went back to try and do a better job than him, okay? Today when we were out, he brought me to show me that wall, and here we go. Now I want you to know, pretend that man is not standing there. Which one of these do you think is best? The one on the left? The one on the left? Raise your hand if you think it's the one on the left. Okay. The one on the right, raise your hand if you think. Slow through. And the reason they like this one better is it's got a picture of a human in it, I suppose. At any rate, that's proof positive of the history. And my point for the people out today was that this is, you can go out and read the landscape. You can be a Stonewall detective. You can extract information from that that is not in your historical archives. It's there. You just have to tease it out. It's a little bit like forensic work, which I've done a fair bit of. Now, I read an article in Connecticut Magazine. Is Connecticut really New England? You can imagine the old joke, it's either Boston or New York, they can't make up their mind. It's just totally preposterous as an assumption, as you know. And so here it is. This is what the author said, and I'm not going to tell you the name of the author because he's actually a pretty nice guy. I mean, he's trying to make a point with a magazine piece. Now it's one big bedroom community for hedge fund managers from New York with some weapons manufacturers and insurance executives tossed in for diversity. That's complete nuts. That is not the Connecticut that I know. Not the one that I came to in 1984. So he went on to say in his article, in search of a longer view, I phoned University of Connecticut geologist Robert Thorson, and he said, and that prompted me to write an article about this for Connecticut Magazine as a rejoinder. Like, why publish a piece of crap like that without publishing the opposite side? And what they did was it was going to be like a column. I was Hartford Current columnist for 15 years, and I thought we were going to spread this out through about 10 or 12 issues, you know? And he said, no, we're going to make a special feature edition, the Connecticut Landscape. So I got 10 essays published in the cover issue of November 23 or something like that. One of them was about Litchfield, okay? And so that's the cover issue of it. And here's the quote. The fifth essay, and they're all short, is called The Hills, okay? The verdant image of inland Connecticut is of gently rolling hills, picture smooth slopes curving up and down the landscape like waves on water, of bucolic pastures, productive farms, and smiling children. That's Litchfield, okay? The other part, the hard scramble image, is equally evocative, and believe me, it gets a lot of mileage. It's some tough old Yankee in a rocky pasture hefting stone to a massive boundary wall, cursing as he works. Okay, so those are two images of the landscape here. And Litchfield and Pomfret are the rolling hills one. They're what we call drumlins. They're what we call thick till. They're what we call lodgement till. There's a special kind of soil, you know, that dominates the greater Litchfield environment here that gives you that smoothness and the richness of the soil for pasture. It's no wonder that your high school girls' team was called the Cowboys, okay? I saw that on the placemat when I had dinner, okay? It's because cows were really important, because these are pasture soils. They don't get any better. They're better than the sand and gravel soils that you'll find elsewhere for producing grass. And I didn't make that up, it's been known for a long time. So I wrote about Litchfield in that essay, and my description of it is in the upper left. Now, Litchfield is that yellow circle in the map. This is a LiDAR image. Now, if you were flying over Connecticut and you look down, you'd see mostly trees, right? That's because you send down 1 billion light rays and you reflect back the rays from the tops of the trees or the twigs or the leaves, right? So you see mostly forest. But what if you sent a spray of laser beams down from an aircraft and you subtracted out all of the beams except the lowest ones. You see? If you do that, you're seeing the landscape through the trees. And when you do that, you get a picture like this. Then you shade it, and then you color code it so that white is high and green is low, okay? And so it's a topographic map and a shaded map all at once. It's an image of Litchfield from the air. And basically what you have down here are these smooth, oval, rolling hills all over the place that are made of that spectacular material. That's what's under much of Litchfield. To the north, we have all kinds of crazy, difficult, challenging rocks, hard rocks, that are carried south by the glacier into this landscape and crushed into your hills. And they are spectacular. And these are the geologic maps. They're kind of hard to get used to at the outset. But basically, if you look at Litchfield on the left, to the north of us is all kinds of crazy heterogeneity in different kinds of rock being carried down to Litchfield. And if you look at the surface map, this dark green here, that's the really beautiful material I'm talking about. It's more concentrated in Litchfield than anywhere else except Pomfret Woodstock on the other side of the state for the same reason. It's hiding in the lee side of a craggy hill to the north. So there's something about the landscape here and in Pomfret Woodstock that gives you much the same landscape, and I think it's just a gorgeous landscape. And then you also have the yellow-green here. That's sedimentary sand and gravel and flatter terrain that gives you lots of interesting topography. Done with that. Binding threads. This comes out of that article that I wrote. Built as barriers between one field and another, one paddock and another, one farm and another. Originally built as barriers, these abandoned walls have become the binding threads of the regional landscape. I really believe that. It worked. I published it. I've thought about it for years. It's like a quilt. We have 40,000 square miles of sort of farm country in New England, and most of it is laced with stone walls. It's laced with it because they had to happen. They just had to happen because of what happened. And also, you know, I married a woman from Maine. Half of her family lives in New Hampshire, and they hate Vermont. You know, Vermont and New Hampshire just don't get along. Most of that is contrived, it's cultural, okay? I mean, I get it. But the landscape and the walls don't care. You know, yes, there are differences in the walls, but the walls unify New England. We don't try to separate ourselves. I moved here from Alaska, which is 2 orders of magnitude larger than all of New England. And I grew up in Minnesota, which is 84,000 square miles. 84,000 square miles. And New England, including the half you've never seen in northern Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, is only 72,000 square miles. So a mid-sized state is larger than all 6 New England states. So if you fly from Alaska and take up a job here, it feels like this is one place. It's definitely a unified place. I have a lot of trouble with a state identity. I don't have any problem with a local identity or a regional identity. So, what I think Robert Frost, he caught the cusp of the transition between the old way and the new way, between the old agrarian culture of New England and the industrializing Gilded Age. I mean, we know that story, I hope. He caught the cusp of that. And he made the walls worth more as symbols for calendars and tourists and then landscape appreciation than I think the walls ever were as fences. I mean, I think they count for more, even by the dollar, you know, by their symbolic and marketing and advertising and cultural unity perspective. And I think he caught that. And I think he just, you know, he's a crusty guy, of course. The other thing is that the most famous poem about a stone wall, Mending Wall, is actually a concatenation of 2 walls. You know, the one about the old Yankee on the one side, you've got to curse the Yankee and keep the barriers intact. You know, good fences make good neighbors. You know, that's one side of it. Yeah, that's absolutely important. But the other side is just the grit and tenacity of New Englanders to keep working in spite of their soils and keep the stones balanced on top of each other. That's the other half of the poem. Those are in different walls on his property. You put them together, you get a really nice New England story. That's why it was so successful. Now, I've long been a fan of Simon Schama, and he wrote this book-length treatise. So it's a doorstopper called Landscape and Memory. It's just a beautiful book about architectural history. And he ends it with a stone wall, a New England stone wall. This giant thing. And so that's it. These are architectural elements that started as ecology. And this is his quote. This is Litchfield. There are places woven within the boundaries of modern metropolitan sprawl. You can drive to New York within a few hours. Okay? You can even drive to Boston if you want. Where the boundaries between past and present, wild and domestic, collapse altogether. We live in a place like that. This is Thoreau's kind of suburb. This is Thoreau's, and you don't live in a suburb here. You live in what I call ruburbia. Okay? It's a contraction of suburb and rural. Now, all my early memories are from North Dakota, Prairie Farmstead, you know, up there, way up. I mean, rural to me is you're more than 3 hours from a medical center. You know, maybe 2 hours from the nearest 4-lane highway. You know, it's really big sky country. It's endless track, all right? That's really rural. No college, you know, for 3 hours in any direction. That's rural. But we don't live in suburban either. This is definitely not suburbia. So what is it? You can live in a place this beautiful, this rural, you know, and still have the amenities, you know, that urban life has to offer, but it's not suburban. It's what I call ruburbia. I thought I invented that term. I didn't. But I'd never seen it before I actually imagined it. And I think it's my perspective that makes me think you can't call this suburban, you can't call it rural either. And J. Bricker Jackson, a landscape historian, I mean, when I read this, I just instantly realized, oh yeah. You know, you have those moments when you read. And what he said was, and we're in a history museum. Historic preservation sees history not as continuity, but as dramatic discontinuity. The whole exhibit out there is photographs, you know, from a century ago, 1.5 centuries ago. There has to be that interval of neglect. It's religiously and artistically essential. That's what I mean when I refer to the necessity for ruins. And you know what it's like with an antique. You know, you buy something, it's not an antique, it's just something you bought, and then it gets a little worn, and it's worth less, right? And then you hold on to it a little longer, and it's worth even less. You hold on to it a little bit longer, you're flat on the bottom, you hold it on a little bit longer, it starts to increase in value. Maybe it's an old gun that didn't work very well. And then you keep that going, and you get past that cusp, and now it's worth a lot of money, right? But there has to be that interval of abandonment or neglect, and this is what our stone walls are. They're produced by one kind of agrarian culture, and they are appreciated in another one. It's not really agrarian, but it's ruburban, and it's a meaningful contact with the landscape, and part of that meaningful contact is the reverence for the past that you see around every corner, and there's no more important message than the stone walls that we see all over the place. They are critical. They are just critical, especially for me, moving here from Alaska. You know, this is the signature landform of New England. This is the thing. I had a lot of colleagues when I first moved here. You know, they'd write their thank you notes on old-fashioned paper, and they'd say, oh, thank you for the visit. It was nice giving a seminar, you know, work in your lab, blah, 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 blah. And my, those stone walls, you know, that's what they would say. Person after person after person, what they noticed was that Minnesota has its lakes, Arizona has its canyons, you know, Kentucky has its caves, that kind of thing, and New England has its stone walls. They are the signature landform of this region, and you are just smack dab in the middle of that. It's really cool. They're important for the aesthetics. The Hudson River School painters painted their stone walls out. They didn't want them, so they didn't bother to include them. And the Impressionists put them in there when they weren't even there. That's that interval of neglect, that passage. And there's folk art in them. No matter where you go, we don't know what this is. I lost track of who sent it to me. If you're in the audience, thanks. You know, I missed the label somewhere. And ecology. This is about human beings before the age of petroleum. You know, you're limited by what you can do, so walls are the result. You can't just do lots with them. and their volumes and areas and lines and corridors and barriers. And there's a reverence. It's no accident that your most well-built wall coming into Litchfield from the east is around the cemetery. We have a reverence for stone. It's no accident that the gravestones are stones. They're important. We actually revere stone if we stop long enough to think about it, because everything comes from rock. Everything, including the air you breathe and the climate we're in, comes from some kind of internal earth process. And for the youth, I don't see a lot of young people in here, okay? If we're going to reach them, we have to do so by saying some things are real. Walls are real. They are not virtual. They're important. And slow is good, not frenetic fast. And I think you can find human nature in a wall, especially one by a stream as lovely as we were today when we went on our pick. Okay, threats. 2 threats. The federal mining engineer, the chief of the U.S. Bureau of Mines, was named Oliver Bowles. And at the time, 1939, when he published this book, human beings in New England wanted one thing more than anything else. They wanted good roads. They were muddy, they were gullied, they were terrible, you couldn't even get anywhere. They were bumpy, they were cobbly, they were terrible. So the solution is to do what we do now, which is to crush rock, right, and put it with a pavement and just lay it on a road and drive happily ever after. That's what we do. But in the 1930s, this was a challenge because they needed a source for that crushed rock. So he said, I got an idea. Let's take all the walls along all the roads in New England and crush them for road subgrade. And they did take a lot of them, maybe a third of it. I know there are crushed stone walls all the way out to the Cape on Wellfleet, and I know that the main turnpike has got a lot of crushed stone in it too. And a lot of roads do around here. So we crushed them up, and you know what? They weren't being bad. They were just being who they were. They had their values on good roads because the roadsters, you know, the 1930s cars had just become available. Who cares about the stone walls? We're not at the mid-20th century reflection on the past. This is a rock crusher on the left from Stanford Historical Society. That'd be really easy. You just go by a wall and throw it in there, and next thing you know, you got a beautiful roadbed. And this is the most absurd one that I've seen. This is from White Mountain National Forest in 1920. They take the walls apart and they lay them down on the road so they can put the pavement on top of it. I have never seen anything like that. But you see what I mean? The walls were not valued, and that was okay because that was the 1930s. So I got involved in this. The New York Times invited an opinion, and I wrote one, and they titled it Strip Mining History. But look at the date on that. That's 2006. That's a long time ago. Okay, I mean, and I had been working with several towns, including Harmontown to the east of you know, to help develop regulations for stone walls. And I did quite a bit of consulting on issues like that as well. But in that article, opening line, I've concluded that the biggest threat to old stone walls is people. And this I took a picture of last week. I drove to a funeral in Newport from Storrs, okay? And I saw it on Route 14, you know, in Scotland and Wyndham. Beautiful country, full of stone walls, really nice country. And there's this guy wanting to solicit. What he's going to do is buy them and ship them to somewhere where there's fewer stone. You want to go land poor, right, stone rich, and send them to stone poor, land rich, if I said that right. You want to make that barter and that transfer. And I saw it again on Route 6. So on both main highways heading east towards Rhode Island, I saw this. And they will do that. I have seen, read about, wrote about 26 acres of farm in Griswold, Connecticut, denuded of stone with machinery. There's no law. You have to get a permit to go in and take some sand out of a property, even if it's private property. But you don't need a permit to go in and harvest all the stone walls. It's crazy, because these are really our binding threats. Now, New England. To geologists, this is New England. Hard rock, hard rock, hard rock, hard rock, layers of hard rock pressed against ancestral North America. That's all I'm going to say about it. Okay? But it's a very distinctive region. You see it on the left in the old Rand McNally version, you know, with the Hudson River and the Champlain Lowland and the St. Lawrence, and even the St. John Valley in Maine bind or bound New England very, very clearly. And Long Island, look, if Nantucket's New England, right? If Martha's Vineyard is New England, if Block Island is New England, Long Island is New England. Okay? It's absolutely clear. It's made of Connecticut scraped and dumped. That's what it is. So this is the root of an old mountain system of Himalayan proportions. That's what Litchfield was. That's what all of Connecticut was. A big squish, continental collision, a descent into the Earth's geothermal heat, the production of all this hard rock, and then the gradual exhumation or removal of 20 miles of stone vertically to get that old mountain root on the surface. You got a tough old mountain root here. And the glacier comes by and it picks up a piece of it and it can't crush it before it drops it. So you end up with stone scattered everywhere. You do not get stone wall like this anywhere else. If you were to just draw a circle around where the phenomenon is, which I did, and put a dot in the middle of it, that's the epicenter. This is a really key slide from Harvard Forest. They've done a lot of study about the New England population. So look at the bottom, that's the year 1600, that's the arrival of Euros. Got it? On the left. And then over here is 2000. We don't need to worry about the future. So that's a linear scale on the bottom. And look at the New England population right here. It's exponential and unbroken. Okay? And then the other curves, the solid black one. This is the curve for the amount of forest we have in all of New England. That's the average. You got it? Really simple. And notice what happened is if you start at 1600, everything in New England is forested, except for the sand dunes and the river and the lakes. Bantam Lake probably was not forested, you see, because it's a natural lake. But almost everything is forested. And what happened was there was a slow removal of the forest up to about the time when we became a country. You know, the Revolutionary War. Slow removal and slow buildup. But once we got past that war, we became a nation. We became proud. We were a new republic. We're going to build the crap out of this and have a better country than anything else in the world. And we did. All right? We built it and built it and built it and built it in the rural landscape. And so this forest came down as the walls went up. And look what happened right around the time of Henry VIII and the Civil War in the 1860s. We hit rock bottom. You know, that's when we had only 30 to 40% of New England is forested. Jessica was showing me some photos of Litchfield, you know, from the 40s or 30s, 1930s or whatever it was. Early photographs. When were they?
1890s.
Yeah, 1890s. And I'm off, but it doesn't matter because it was really after the 30s that we really had a lot of that reforestation. And so you can see what happened here is that we spread until we got wheels and we could afford, and then we had a middle class and we had people buying, you know, communities in places like this, houses and homes. All right? So there's that steep decline and then the rise back in the forest cover. And so what happened is the stone walls are coming in as the forest is cut down, and they are being covered as the forest goes back, with about a generational delay, if that makes sense. Okay, so that's the key thing I wanted to make. That's the data. And one thing that took me a number of years to figure out is that in New England, the passage and the stone walling is like a wave, a long, slow wave that has a crescendo and a decline. But in places like Ireland on the right, where people never left, right, it's not a wave, it's just a continuum. And so you get more and more stone. If the Hudson River had been an ocean, right, you know, and you guys in Litchfield were on an island, right, you wouldn't have gone as much west or down south or out to the 40, you know, we would have been isolated. You would have intensified your build on the landscape the way they did on Block Island, and we would have more stone. And the forest wouldn't have even come back. So we had a major historical change that tied into that. So the idea is it's a wave. I'm guessing that if you average New England, half of the walls were built in a 50-year period between the end of the Revolution and the Erie Canal. And if you add 25 years to either side of that, you know, so you've got a century, you're still talking 1750 to 1850. You know, that's still most of the walls being built. And the signature landform, I'm going to be quick here. My voice is starting to crack a little bit. But to have stone walls, you have the Venn diagram of 3 essential things. 3 things. You have to have hard rocks, not soft rocks. If you have soft rocks, the glacier just picks them up and crushes them. It's like if you drive from Boston to Buffalo, New York, on back roads, you'll just see wall after wall after wall after wall. You cross Hudson Valley, you climb up the other side, you go to sedimentary rock, and you don't see any stone walls. And if you go from southern Maine, where there's all kinds of stone walls for dairy farms and whatever, and you just go north, you lose the walls. You lose them because you leave the agricultural country and you go into the woods and lakes country. And if you go from Fairfield County, Connecticut, which has just got walls everywhere, and you get past the Big Apple and you get into central New Jersey, you lose the walls. You lose the walls because you're south of the glacial border. So you need to be on land that the glacier just crunched along, you know, and spread the stones out. And you need to have a place that needed lots of fences. You know, a livestock tillage is what I call it. You know, to keep the cows out of the corn, those old songs and whatever. You need to have lots of fences. And a land use that is mostly about pasture and animals stomping on the ground. And then you get stone walls. And you need those 3 things. Take one out, you lose the walls to the north because you lose the farms. You lose the walls to the west because you lose the hard rocks. You lose the walls to the south because you lose the glacier bottom soils. And only in New England do you have all 3 of these together. Only in New England. That's why it's so distinctive. That's why it's the signature landform. Now, these are rock-sorted polygons in Finnish Lapland. You know, it's just cold Arctic country. And what you see is a fine-grained mineral soil center, and coarse rock around the edges. Do you see that? This is a natural process that just sorts coarse from fine. And these are vast, and they cover, you know, enormous areas of the permafrost. This is just a picture of them. They're stone-sorted polygons, and they're mechanically sorted by swelling and soil processes. Now let's get to pastures. Here's a pasture on the upper right in Lebanon, Connecticut. You know, the animals are creating the stone by stomping and compacting and frost heaving. You get beyond the edge of the fence, you just don't have the surface stone. See that? See that? Now it's an oversimplified view, but that's the basic idea. If you were to get the ant down here on the lower left, it doesn't care about the beauty of that anthill. It doesn't even care about the anthill, he's just dumping it. Right? He's just removing the stuff for their lives to live underground, and it has the same shape as a cinder cone for the same reason. It's just mechanical particulates moving around. This is the same thing along the edge of a field. It's just getting rid of what you don't want. Don't get me wrong. We love stone walls, especially when they're built up. But the initial process is waste stone. Waste stone is the #1 reason why we have walls all over New England. Once you get past that, then you can start thinking about fencing. But you got to get that stone out of the way. There's a fractal pattern. You start out with a big farm, 110 acres or something like that. You divide it in half, then you divide that in half, you divide that in half. That's like a fractal polygons. You know, when you're breaking up mud cracks, they just break into progressively smaller squares. And that's what we got on the right. And one of these is frost polygons on the right, on the left. One is frost polygons and one is stone walls in Petersham, Mass. And they don't look that different. The one on the left is Petersham, Mass, and the one on the right, left-right, that's a natural feature. But it looks just like the pattern. It's a polygonal fractal pattern. Okay, so a cascade of processes. You ever read that book, If You Give a Moose a Muffin, or something like that, you know, or you give somebody a cookie, they'll want jam to go with it, and then they'll run out of jam, and you know, it's like the house that Jack built, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah, so the house that Jack built. All of those things, there's a cascade of processes, one leads to the other. And that happened in our fields. That happened in Litchfield. The first thing you want to do is clear the pasture soil. You got to clear the forest. When you do that during the neoglaciation, or the Little Ice Age, when you do that, you got colder soils, more exposure, deeper frost heave, compacted soils, more runoff, whatever, you produce copious stone. okay? That's what happens. Step 2, you have to scuttle and dump that stuff somewhere. Yes, there are piles here, but most of the time you move the piles to the edge. And you've already got wooden fence lines, but you just put the stone there. Then the third thing, you stack it. If you go into a library and all the books are on the floor, there's no room to get around, right? So what do? You take the books and you stack them up so that you don't have to walk on them. The same thing is true if you've just got a giant scatter of stone near the edge of your fields. It's like 2 rooms wide. What you want to do is just stack that together, and it takes up less space. You have more farm for your money. So there's a stacking phenomenon to conserve space. But you're also interested in marking territory, and you also can start using it as fences. These functions don't have to compete with each other. They work together. You see, so there's multiple functions for a stone wall, one of which is architectural. Once you get past that stage, now you've got enough stone in a stack, you can do something beautiful with it, you start doing architecture. Nothing wrong with that, but it comes after all the rest. And then we had abandoned, and then we had Robert Frost, and then we are now redeeming stone walls, and that's my story there. So I tried to tell this cascade in a book. This is a strange story. This is a book that I wrote 17 drafts of before it was published, rejected several times, and then it won the State Book Award. I think that's why I was invited to the best nonfiction. And next thing you know, I'm a columnist and writing, and it's total freak out, right? So, but what happened was it became a classic, so old that it came out in audio. Now they're selling more in audio than they did in print. So it's an old book, but it's still going around. And I tried to tell this story in 10 chapters. The last one being the most important. Written in stone, it's about the philosophical meaning of nature. I'm not going to go through that. Stonewall science. One key idea that we talked a lot about today was that you have good historic archives for Litchfield. You got photographs, you got stuff like that. But there's another archive out there in the stone walls. You can pull information from them that will either support or refute assertions made by Litchfield historians. And nothing wrong with corroborating evidence. If you have the story of the stone wall matches the story of the description of what happened in that part of the town, that's great. So stone walls are there to be read. They're a story in each stone, you can take them apart. And so that's why this book was titled The History in Stone Walls, not of stone walls. I'm not reading a book and writing about stone walls. I'm looking at the walls, I'm interrogating them, and then trying to write what happened and explain it. And this is not new stuff for me. This has been going on since 1998. This is about all you're going to get in archives. Getting stone, making wall. It doesn't tell you what kind of wall, or how big, or why, or where it came from. But that information is there. It can be inferred based on the kinds of detective work things that I've been talking about. Here's an example from Hillstead. That's in Farmington. I drove through it on the way here, right by it. That's a beautiful red paint, but that's not paint. That's jasper. It's a mineral. It's a hydrothermal precipitate from the volcanic terrain, when that rock was being formed. And there's all kinds of stories here. There's stories about steamy volcanisms and seismicity and a subtropical climate with the brownstone in the upper left. There's an icy glaciation. There's human folk art, or they wouldn't have done that. And then there's dryland life. Look at where the organisms are. They're only in the shade. So there's lots of things that can be paid attention to, and there's a rich history story in there, not just a prehistory story. Okay, so my first try was in 2005. I published a book called Exploring Stone Walls. My publisher made me do it, one of those kind of stories, and I tried to make stone wall watching equivalent to bird watching. Things were going fine until Harry Potter's publisher bought mine and just decided to let this thing go out of print, naturally. But this is available. I think I talked about it here in town a while back. It's a good early clue on detective work. My nth try is this historical archaeology piece. I will ignore that. I'm trying to get this vetted. Now the definition of a stone wall. Is that a wall? Of course. Why? Is it a dumb question? No. If a lawyer says that's a pile, and another lawyer says, no, that's a wall, and there's a regulation about walls, but no regulation about piles, it really matters. You see? I'll tell this anecdote, and I told it this afternoon. Last year, the town of Concord, Mass., founded in 1635, rich in history and in historical conservation, called me and said, what's a stone wall? Because they can't agree. The utility side, the truck people, you know, that want to keep their roads clear and do this, they think about it one way. That's a wall, not a wall. And the historic group thinks about it another way. And they wanted some resolution, and who am I to say what that is to the oldest town? You know, but basically I'm trying to be scientific about it. That's why it matters. So yeah, that's a wall. The state definition, oh, there is one. I'm ignoring it. If you think about art, and you think about 18th century nudes, and you think about 20th century pornography, what's the boundary between pornography and art? You know, it's hard to define. It's easy to define a stone wall. Everybody knows what they are, and for 90% of them, it's not going to matter, because we all know it's a stone wall. But what about those things on the edges? You know, is it or is it not? Well, I struggled with this for at least a decade, and I got a lot of help from groups like this in the field and whatever, and I finally published a classification and a nomenclature and a description for the phenomenon that seems to be working. All right, at least it's held up for 2 years. And a wall has to meet 5 criteria. Normally you don't have to do this, you know, but if you're in court, you need a definition. A wall has to be elongated, right? It can't be a pile, you see? A stone wall has to be made of stone, right? A stone wall has to be made of grains. It has to be granular. It has to be made of pieces, you know, rather than one great big slab of rock. Like the beach is granular, right? A stone wall is granular. You got it? Okay, it has to be continuous. That thing on the lower left is not a stone wall because you can walk right through it. All right? But if you push the boulders together, it would be a wall. You see? And look at this. We've seen a lot of these. These are beautiful cairns. That meets every criteria of a stone wall, except one. It's not elongated. And height is the most difficult one. And so the basic rule of thumb is, based on lots of interviews, is it's knee-high or higher, you know? And who cares if it's even not all the way up to your knee, you know? You know, the idea is it has to be something you don't want to step over, you know? Or stones are resting on other stones. You know, it's a tumble-down thing. That's a wall. So that's the hardest criteria. And when you put all that together, I got a slide from Colin Hardy. He sent me, see that thing on the left? That meets all of the criteria of a stone wall definition, except it's not made of stone. Okay? You see it's against an old fence line, and it's rubble, and it's gotten out of the way. It's just, I know you got it, or you wouldn't be snickering. You know, that basically, so the stone domain. Walls are not the only thing. There's piles, there's cellar holes, there's notable stones, there's gravestones, there's glacial erratics, there's all kinds of cool things. So I just lump all of that into the stone domain. The fundamental unit is the wall segment. Just like in biology, the cell is the fundamental unit, in stone wall science, the segment is. It's a reach where things are more or less the same. You could have a limestone reach go to a basalt reach, you see, along the same line of the wall. Those would be 2 segments, 1 wall. You get it? That's the way it works. Okay, and then the wall, the parcel, the segment, you can basically work out the topology of this. Stone and rock are not the same. Stone is made from rock. Stone is an object. Okay, stone is an object made of rock. The material is rock, the object is stone. This chair is an object called chair. See? It's an object called chair made of the material plastic and metal. This is an object called stone made of a material called rock. It's not complicated. And I got a beautiful piece here of beautiful shiny microschist from the walk this afternoon if you want to take a piece of your local bedrock. And Stonehenge, that's not Rockhenge. Because the emphasis is on the rock. Look at this, this is ridiculous. If you really wanted to get to the nitty-gritty, measurement is important. You don't have to get this detailed, but the terminology matters. So now let's talk about terminology. Look at that thing in the upper left. There's a ball sitting on a slab over 2 prisms over 1 block. You see how easy that is? Those are just terms. This is a pillow, almost like a disc. Those are tablets. And up there, those are blocks. These are tablets. These are balls. Okay? And these are prisms. They're just shapes. The degree of order. The one in the upper left, that stone just pitched along a fence line. There's no order to it. The one on the next one is stacked, but not laid. No mason is doing that. They'd be embarrassed to do that. That's a farmer's or a farmer's kid doing that. Then the one on the next one, that's laid. You actually have courses. You know, you care about where the pieces go. And then finally, if you have patterned, you have a laid wall that has some folk art embellishment or architectural motif to it. So those are 4 degrees of order that are very easy to recognize. And what you'll find is if you start paying attention to the terms, you'll be paying attention to the walls. The structure, that's a 2-tiered wall on the left. There's an ugly brown gray tier on the bottom and a quartz boulder tier on the top. Courses of stone, just laid like brick. Segments, there's a boulder segment on the left and a block segment on the right. Do you see that? And on the bottom, 2 segments, one falling apart from rust and one in good shape. There's an abutting contact where one just is built against the other. And then there's an L junction as opposed to a Y junction or a T junction. Classification, on and on and on. This object fails the continuity or height requirement, so we call it a line. This one fails the elongation, so we call it a concentration. That one fails the granularity, so we call it a notable stone. That one fails the height requirement on the right. Okay, now, a class wall has 5 families. The family has 6 types. This is in the weeds, you don't need to know this. But here's a good example. That's a weird wall. I had the credit, yeah, Elizabeth Dillman. The domain, clear, it's made of stone. It's clearly a wall. It's freestanding because it has 2 sides. It's a single wall because it's not built from both sides. It's a panel because it's only 1 stone thick. It's not like a triangle. You know, it's just like one built stacked on top of another. So that's a panel. And then there's a special variant of panel walls called lace walls, which are both bare. And so you can use the terminology, this one term, like a lace wall, you know, tells you all of the other things. That's the beauty of a classification. If I say lobster to you, you know what I'm talking about, because there's a name for something complicated, right? If not, I'd have to describe it to you every single time. You know, it's a hard-shelled critter that's often red, you know, it's got 2 claws. And, you know, we get tired of saying that over and over again, so we just use the word lobster. That's what I'm suggesting. We have a name for specific things, and it's easy to inventory and map when you do that. Okay, it gets complicated, so we'll skip that. It gets worse, so we'll skip that. And now we plan for conversation. This gets messy, and it's not as interesting as stonewall science, but it's essential to manage and conserve your resources or they'll be gone. There's still people wanting to buy your walls. Okay. Who owns the walls? Is this a town? Is it a state? Is it a land trust? Is it a family, a private owner? You know, whose jurisdiction is it? Is it an indigenous nation? Is it the National Park Service? You know, you got to figure that out. Then you've got to start thinking about the visuals, the indigenous, the archaeology, the historic sites, rights and legality, scenic roads, dryland ecology, and the process cascade. So these are like the background elements to go into managing. We're almost done. I know this is a lot. And then mapping. We now have this LiDAR, which allows us to image all kinds of interesting things. The walls on the left. This is an old aerial photograph, and this is the leaf-off photography from a couple of years ago. But the bottom line is you can inventory walls. These are the kinds of walls on a parcel. You could imagine your land trust today having an inventory of walls on a parcel. You can imagine the height of walls, you see, on a parcel. So now you have a type of wall and a height of the wall, and then the degree of order. Is it dumped, stacked, or laid, you see? And you can have all this information there on a piece of property, and you can then use that to make inferences about what actually happened there. Who cared about what and when? I just Googled person sleeping, and this is what came up. Okay? But this is the Act 2023. There was an act passed by the state of Connecticut that defines a stone wall, and I just think it's absurd. But such is life. Maybe some of you in the audience helped it. It's full of issues. The parallel with wetlands I mentioned. All I did was take the EPA's description of wetland values, and I changed one word from wetland to dryland, and most of it still applies. And the word fish, you might have issues with, but some walls are submerged, like beneath Quabbin Reservoir and probably places in Litchfield. They're providing reef fish habitat. They're not drylands, but you know what I'm getting at. So I published this article, I already mentioned that. Citizen science is cool. New Hampshire is mapping stone walls. The citizens have mapped 7,000 miles worth of stone walls in the last few years. It's wicked cool, and we're developing something like that for Connecticut. There are forms of pamphlets and education that I imagine coming out of this. And this is the stepwise approach, and I think it's my last slide. Looks like a hard one, but after the background that I talked about, the key idea is build a geographic information system layer in your town. You've got one for the assessments of properties, you've got one for your parks, you've got one for your wetlands, you've got one for your whatever, zoning, right? You know what I'm talking about, just a map of your town. It's got map units on it. You can have a map layer in that system that's about the stone domain. And you can populate that by having an expert come down from LiDAR to map all these possibilities, and then come up from the historical societies and the graveyard associations and the old people that do stuff, and bring that up from the bottom, and you get a layer of all the inventory of your stone stuff in your town. And then you inventory that with a classification system and a description. And then you have a rich resource to compare with the history and to educate your children and to have a good time wall watching instead of bird watching. It's just as cool. It's cooler, I think, because they don't fly away. And you can have binoculars and be cool if you like binoculars, because sometimes walls are on private property and you can look at them without going there, right? But just don't look in the picture windows, right? Or something like that. You can do that. And then once you classify them and describe them, we can interpret them. And then property issues. Yeah, there's always issues when you get into management. Who owns it? What about edges and points? And I think if you have a preserved farm, I think a farm should be sort of removed from any if they're still as a working farm, I think the rules probably should not apply to them, all right? Because they're just trying to do what they've always been doing. But if it's ex-farm property, you have a couple of different cases to think about. And the deal is, the choice is yours. It's going to be the land trust decision or the town's decision or a private property owner's decision about what to do. It'll never be mine. But I've been trying to advise people, and I'm just jump-starting it. I mean, I'm not going to last forever. So I thought, well, I should probably, start working more on the evangelical for conservation. It's not as interesting as the evangelical for the appreciation. But I really think it's time for us to to inventory what we have. We can appreciate it, but if you inventory it and understand it, and it starts shouting information at you, you know, you're going to love it even more. And it's just not that expensive. And it's a way of getting young people involved, because they can be out there in the field with clipboards or their digital gadgets, you know, entering the data as you do this inventory, and get them involved in this process. I mean, if they have a reason to use a gadget outdoors, they'll go outdoors, but not without a gadget. And so I think it's just a great opportunity to, and you know, it's not like I haven't seen kids. I've been teaching college since 1979, and I had 4 kids of my own, and they're long gone. You know, so I know where they're at. And I know that when I run into young kids, they love this stuff. If you just get them out there. I had 164th graders a couple of months ago. They were loving it. They were just eating it right up. It helps to be 4th grade, not 8th grade. And if any of you want any help with anything, my voice helped, but barely. All right? All you got to do is go to the Stonewall Initiative. Just Google Robert Thorson or Stonewall Initiative or whatever. You'll find my phone number. All right? And you can just email or find an email, and just email me, and I'll do my best to help you. And this is serious for me, because I've been on this a long business, and I really want to ramp it up one notch, you know, and get that GIS layer for your town's sake, and for your land trust sake, and for your historical society's sake. Okay? So thank you. Well done.
That doesn't sound as good.
I'll take questions. Yes.
So tossed and dumped are 2 distinct things.
What are the same?
Tossed, I read your book, and you talk about tossed walls.
Oh.
But here you're not mentioning tossed walls, you're talking
Yeah,
about dumped
yeah,
walls.
that's old. That's 2002. I'm writing in 2000. I thought a lot more about it when I was trying to classify these things. A tossed wall and a dumped wall and a farmer's wall and a single wall and a pasture wall, they're all the same. In New Jersey, they're called stone lines.
Well, about when did people living in homes decide that they were kind of a nice thing to have, and they started getting masons in to build them and to use them for decorative purposes, or rather than just boundaries?
That has been true probably since the very first beautiful wall was built in front of some ancient church. You know, so that isn't new. But the last 30 or so years, there's been an upsurge in interest in maintaining stone walls. And my rule of thumb, we were talking about this today, if you have a closed canopy forest and you have a wall that's sort of disintegrating out there in the woods, leave it alone. It's busy, my advice is leave it alone. It's busy being archaeology, it's busy being a clock for us, it's busy being habitat, you know, and it's kind of cool to see the time at the millennial scale. You know, so I really recommend, you can do whatever you want on your property, but this is my recommendation. But if you have a wall that is quasi-architectural, like it's on a roadside or it's in view somewhere, and I think that if it starts to fall apart, you know, I think the person who built it would like to see it repaired and put back where it was. And that way we can have the best of both worlds. But what really bugs me is when you go into a closed canopy forest and you strip mine, you know, 20 acres of walls and then go sell them somewhere. I'll tell you a quick story. I published this book and I didn't know what was going to happen. And I got an email from a woman in San Diego, and she said, "Oh, thank you so much for writing the book. I really, really liked reading about New England stone walls. It was so moving for me that I wanted to I went to the store next door and bought some. And there are 18-wheelers covered with New England stone walls heading west. I've seen them, I've written about them. The mosses and lichens are still clinging onto them, you know, and they're shipping west. And you saw that sign, we buy stone walls. That's a guy with a front-end loader and a dump truck.
Do you see much thievery going on?
There's some, but not a lot. There used to be a lot more. And I was really outraged early in the business about this, because I was not a New Englander. I thought, this is a really valuable resource, and you're strip mining it. That's why the New York Times published that title. That's basically what was happening. And the saddest case that I knew about was a woman, a widow, built a wall with her husband. It was just out, you know, the kitchen window kind of thing, you know, where you look out the kitchen window every day and you say good morning to the birds and the bird feeder and all that. So she had built a wall with her husband out there, and the thieves were coming by at night, taking it. So she covered it with old rugs, old rugs. And I said, well, it doesn't look very nice. I mean, why did you do that? She said, this is really sad. I'd rather know it's there, all right, than to look at it. So that's where it gets. And then there's a case in Lebanon. I got a bunch of cases, but there's like, oh gosh, there's this great idea. And so the contractor went in and stripped, like 10 acres of stone. And then he built a bunch of, not McMansions, but, big sized houses, new houses. And then he said, would you like a stone wall to go with that? Right? And he says, I'll put a stone wall on your yard, at 10 times the money, and built the walls back. And it's not the same thing. You don't take an old violin apart and build a new one, just for the wood. Yeah.
Everybody in this room will know this, where Thorncrest Chocolate is. When you go in the gate, the column on the right-hand side, the top's all broken off. You know what happened? Somebody stole it.
Wow.
Yep. Did that beautiful job rebuilding and somebody stole that top.
Well, it's really easy to steal a wall. All you have to do is have somebody with a truck and somebody else with a flashlight up there and somebody else with a flashlight down there. And if you're at 2 in the morning and you hear somebody, you see someone coming, you just flash your buddy and they basically just, hide. And then when the car's gone, you just keep loading. I've got a dozen stories, but it's no more than that. I got 20 years worth of stories, yeah.
So I know you weren't a big fan of the law, but
Yeah.
does the law say anything about the We Buy Stone Walls guys, or not?
Not really. Not really.
I know stealing is one
There
thing,
are if you go to the Stonewall Initiative website, there's a thing on legalities there, and there's some links on that, including a list of ordinances in towns. I mean, I've been working with different towns, and I forget which ones over the years, but it all comes down to the same thing. You can't do a damn thing to the interior of a private property owner. That's sacrosanct, and it should be. So instead of legally going after them, what you want to do is, even though it would be true for taking Peter's hand off their property, is to just convince them to do the right thing, and not strip mine the walls for the rest of us. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that, and I know I said this earlier because I wrote it in that book there, that nobody owns the landscape. Taylor may own that lot, and McDermott may own that lot, and whatever, but we drive around and we're all in this together. If somebody builds a purple hacienda, on the entrance to Litchfield, it's not going to look very good, even if it's private and legal.
So if you had some acreage and you had some stone walls back in the woods where nobody
Yes.
ever looked at it, and you wanted to do some kind of a terrace or something with a little wall in your yard, would
Yeah.
you leave those historically accurate
It-
walls and go buy stones, or would you
I think that's
use
a
your
good,
own stones?
I think that's a good, that's a really good point. That's going to be your decision. My instinct is to leave the wild walls wild. I think they're wildlife, and if you buy stone, you're not buying strip mine stone from somewhere else. You're probably buying quarry stone. And you can also get stone that is, well, what's the euphemism for that? When you have, good coffee or whatever, it's free trade, that's what it is. You can get like free trade stone walls. You can get stone that's grubbed out of places that aren't strip mine stone walls. But please, as a buyer, just be sensitive to where it comes from. And you don't need a mason to build a stone wall. They'll want you to say that. You just need someone with a strong back. That could be a grandchild, that could be a Boy Scout, that could be anything. Because most of these walls are built by farmers and teenagers and farmers' wives and whoever knows. They're just built by whoever could heft the stones. They weren't necessarily put together as a beautiful mason wall. But you do need a source of stone. And I think in some cases, piles, I think they're less sacrosanct than walls. And there's a lot of piles on properties that are not used, yes.
I wondered if you, in addition to all the reasons you explained about the geological and environmental construct of why walls are where they are in this area of New England. If you have found or looked into, or are there any patterns or cultural traditions that relate to what settlers were bringing from Great Britain or the Scots-Irish or the particular parts of England where settlers came to this, and you said, or the period you said about the Revolutionary War, and also looking at the patterns of the fence lines that you showed in various ways. Do they repeat what was in Great Britain, or is it really more about the topography and geology and the clearing it out?
It's just a wonderful question. It's a multi-layered question. The short answer is not really. I like to think of the walls in New England as being more sort of natural and less cultural. I mean, you just got to do it. You know, you're clearing your land, you got a scuttle zone, you build the walls, there's the wave goes by, and you move on. And there really isn't time to really invest in cultural traditions to emulate the stone walls of some other place in Europe, okay? This is not to say that coastal villages, you know, in the mid-17th century didn't build a few walls that might have looked like those in England. That's not what we're talking about for Litchfield. And that's not what we're talking in the interior. It wasn't until after King Philip's War, you know, in the 1680s or so, you know, that we really had some chance to occupy the inland. And people clustered along the shore until that time. And then we moved in, especially after the Revolution. So it's more of an American phenomenon. And you will find that it's whoever has labor, because there's no craftsmanship going into it. It's stacking stone and piling it and stacking it, making it look nice. And you know, most of these designs are pretty simple. A single wall or a double wall, you know, that's old standard. But we don't have these weird copestones, you know, where the stones are vertical. We don't have the ones, you know, all slanted and sideways. We don't have 8-foot-high walls in very few places. It's really a low, thigh-high, adjunct to an agrarian civilization that largely went kaput. And I'm trying to maximize the value of that former agrarian civilization as ruins, because we have a necessity for ruins. And the more we leave them and revere them as ruins, you know, you don't take the pyramids apart to build a pier. You know, I mean, we could take our walls apart in the 1930s to build good road beds. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, you know, but not now. Not now. The land is too important. The past is too important. I mean, I don't know about you. I mean, we haven't talked about politics all night, you know, the world does seem to be kind of spinning, you know, off its axis in many ways. And I think the solidity of stone and the comfort of walls. I want every single person here to find a stone wall the next week and go put your hand on one of those stones. Just put your hand on it, close your eyes for a minute, and think about a real person putting that stone there 2 centuries ago. That should connect you, not to the cosmos, but to the part of the cosmos that matters, which is the earth. Is one great, big, beautiful, gorgeous system. And I think if you see a stone in your day, you've had a better day. You know, I think seeing a tree is great. I think seeing water is great. I think seeing, you know, living things is great, flowers. But I think seeing stone is really important too. It makes you feel better. It grounds me and most people that I've talked to. Otherwise, we wouldn't bury our dead beneath stones and surround them with stones. It's really important. I mean, rock is the mother of us all. My mantra for every course I teach is no rock, no ecosystem, no culture. Or the philosopher Will Durant said, civilization exists by geological consent, subject to change without notice. Okay? And it's really true. The phosphorus in every cell in your body comes from a mineral called apatite. Okay? And without biochemistry, you know, sort of aggregating, you know, and dissolving and taking that phosphorus and making it available to you, you couldn't do your thing. It's really important. That's a mineral. Your teeth are minerals. Similar minerals, hydroxyapatite, the enamel, the carbon. The whole atmosphere came out of the earth when it boiled. Earth melted, it boiled. The atmosphere is regulated by what's going on. That's what the whole fossil fuel thing is about. You know, we're basically regulating the flux of carbon between the atmosphere and the crust. And we're messing with it, but it's been going on forever. We're just changing the rates.
Could I,
Yes?
do these, have you ever looked into Pennsylvania and
Yeah.
the walls continue? Because their historic homes, many of them are stone.
Yes, yes. So that's a complicated question, and I've heard that one before. When I say, there are stone walls in every state. There are stone walls in Pennsylvania, there are stone walls even in Michigan, you know. There are stone walls down in the Southwest, you know, there are stone walls in the Sierras. But the idea is that if you go to the Kentucky bluegrass country, if you go there, the walls are kind of a local phenomenon, or they occur only in certain situations. But in New England, they're just ubiquitous. So the deal is in New England, you have to explain the absence of stone walls.
Yeah.
You know, whereas you get out of New England, you have to explain the presence of stone walls. And by the way, when I drove into Litchfield, I came via Farmington and Harmonton. I'm just having a good time. I can't wait to see those stone walls in Litchfield. Well, I really didn't see very many. And that's the reason, because I'm through Harmonton, there's just wall, 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 wall. And then I come into the Litchfield country and I start to see where the town, you know, you go up the hill and the walls are simply not there. They probably were.
No, I have an answer for that.
They're probably gone.
Route 118 was built in
Yeah.
the 70s.
Yeah. And
And went through, you know, open land. If you go up Old
Okay.
East Litchfield Road, there's stone walls lining on the
Right.
other side.
But what about all of the yards and open space and houses, you know, on that hillside? That should have had stone walls on it. Just like UCONN campus, you know, had stone walls everywhere, but to build a campus, you move all the walls away. You know, so there's a difference between the settlement pattern coming from Harmonton for someone who's paying attention. And that's fine. And yes, a lot of walls ended up being removed. But lately, I had a few victories. You know, now when they rebuild a highway or widen a road, the state highway board, you know, they actually have to conserve the walls along the edge, or remove them or rebuild them. Yeah, there's a lot of new stuff going on. It's just slow and piecemeal because it's so this is the podium. I gotta be a stump evangelist. I gotta pound it. You know, this is me. It takes a Norwegian, Scandinavian American from Minnesota via Alaska to say, I really love these walls, let's keep them here. You know? And I think this is a very sympathetic crowd. It does get dicey, you know, when it comes down to ownership and property. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit more about using stone walls as a basis for fences? I don't understand how that would have worked before barbed wire. So,
Okay, a lot of people call stone walls stone fences. It's just an idiom that came from Europe. Most of the walls in New England never got higher than your knee.
I
or a thigh.
thought a lot of them were used to keep animals in.
They were, but there's a lot of talk about that, but every time you see a stone wall to keep animals in, there's electric fence or wire fence on the top of it.
So they weren't used that way.
They
until-
were, but only for the bottom half. It's more of a complicated story. In Mansfield, Connecticut, where I live, all right, there's 150, you have town meetings here?
Sure.
156 town meetings in a row. The number one question that came up on the agenda was fencing, all right? And in most of New England, the legal height of a fence was 4.5 to 4 feet. It's like a 3-board equestrian fence, you know how high it is. You know, that's the height of a legal fence, and most stone walls don't get above the knee. So that means even if they served as the bottom of fences, all right, you had to add wood or wire or something on top to make it be a legal fence.
So did they use wood before
Yes.
they used wire?
Wood was everywhere. All the early fences, except in the weirdest cases, would have been made of wood, okay, in the normal settlement process. But then what happens is, when you have a wooden fence and a cleared field, and your field is covered with stones, you just scuttle the stone outward. and then that stone begins to accumulate in the vicinity of the fence. So the logical thing to do is just stack it up. And so then the stone becomes the bottom half of the fence. And in some cases, the stone just keeps growing, and you burn all your wood, and you can use the stone to build a fence that's legal height. But most of them are not legal height. So the answer is they're related. The stone comes more from having the animals create the stone by trampling, you know, the soil than it does from it. I mean, it's like the business of sheep, the sheep craze. You know, people say, oh, we built all these stone walls so we can farm sheep. No, it's the other way around. You bring the sheep on the pasture and they just like wreck the landscape, you know, and nibble out all the grass and stomp your hoofs everywhere, right? And you get frost heave and stone. Then you move the stone out that the sheep created. But the wooden fences were there at the outset. I mean, we saw that with Jim's picture. I mean, you've got, here's a zigzag stone wall. That's idiotic, all right? There's a wooden fence there first. Nobody builds a zigzag stone wall and then puts a fence on top of it. It's just a visual proof of that. And I'm so glad you like my picture better. There, take that.
I have a question.
Okay.
And it's abstract compared to all of this, so it's sort of like
Thank you.
changing subject almost.
Oh, you gotta cut it off, by the way. You gotta cut this off.
You want me to
Somebody,
stop?
no, I'm fine with you. But I'm saying that I can go on all night, but somebody has to cut them off. There's a critical moment.
There was a slide that showed, I think it said Latlet. And
Yes.
it was, these triangles created, was that a seismic event? Was
No,
that
no,
man-made?
polygons.
Why did that happen? Why were they pushed?
You have a half space or just a uniform flat surface, okay, that has a mix of stone and non-stone in the soil, okay? And then what happens is you freeze the hell out of it, all right? And you basically freeze it down and then heave it up. What happens is the frost, if there's any gravitational gradient to it at all, like even 1 degree, if you heave up a stone, it will start to migrate outward. And if you think about a honeycomb with polygons, or mud cracks that have polygons. So if you have just a slight elevation from a little bit of frost heave in one place, you're going to have a gravitational slide, all right, of the stones working outward to the edges.
So that would only happen there.
No, it happens in permafrost terrains, but it can happen elsewhere. But the idea is that if you have a bunch of these cells working, the most efficient thermodynamic shape is a polygon, a hexagon.
That's fascinating.
And so my point in showing that is here's a natural mechanism for sorting, coarse from fine. And then just think that that's what farmers are doing. You know, and they're like the ant who's building an anthill. They're not thinking really about, they're just doing what they're doing. You know, but they got to move the stone and they move it out, and this guy over here is moving stone this way. And so those two outward pushes of stone come together, and that's where your fence line is, and that's where the stone concentrates. And given the tendency for rectangular fields, we ended up having pretty much, most of our polygons are four-sided. So they don't have a wall.
Yeah.
I think the walls in New England would be hexagons if it wasn't for that habit of us having square fields. Just thinking about it as a scientist, yeah.
So, I recently got back from Antarctica.
Yeah.
Somebody behind?
Oh, that's okay, people dribble off, that's what happens.
Well,
Eventually they cut it off.
I recently got back from Antarctica, and there's
Yeah.
a place where there are columns, maybe at least 200 feet tall, and they're composed of hexagons that are about a foot across. And there's columns that's just spectacular. They go up for hundreds of feet, and
Made
they
of
all
rock?
form in hexagons.
Made of rock.
Basalt, yeah.
Yeah. That's the same phenomenon that gives you that polygonal ground. What happens is that if you have a uniform sheet of hot lava and it starts to cool, it contracts. It contracts. And if you have just like something the size of this room, you'll never get a decent pattern. But if it's the size of a mile or half a mile, you know, when it contracts, you dissipate that stress at regular intervals. And when you do that in 2 dimensions on a surface, you get a crack that forms a polygon. And then what happens to make those columns is if you have a polygon on the surface, but you're cooling from the top down, right? you can cool 100 meters into the earth, right? And those cracks propagate down through the basalt. And when you do erode the edge, give it a chance to fall apart, you'll see those spectacular columns.
It's the same.
And you have them in a lesser degree on the beautiful lava flows in the Central Valley of Connecticut. You have them in the Palisades Sill above Hastings on Hudson. I mean, I see them all the time. I have 3 grandkids living in Hastings on Hudson, and the Palisades are right across, so every time I go visit, I go look at the Palisades. And that's the same phenomenon.
Robert, thank you very, very much. Robert has maybe last question perhaps?
Yeah, how about, do you ever deal with, encounter stone bridges that are built by farmers?
What?
Stone bridges that are built by
Oh,
farmers.
yeah, but it's a complicated story. The simplest stone bridge is really a causeway. And you just throw stone in a low spot. You build a broad wall. You build like a wall over here and a wall over here, and you just pitch stone under it, and you try and have a culvert under it. And you can have that culvert by just having a little bit of coarse open space, and that usually works. But yes, there are bridges, but not very many important bridges. Those are usually engineered works from towns and whatever.
Build dams.
What?
Build dams.
Yeah, a lot of dams. There's some amazing stone wall at the first place. Yeah, those dams. How about the Great Stone Dam in Lawrence, Massachusetts? It was considered one of the engineering wonders of the world. It was all the way across the Merrimack, built of cut stone. So, we don't do that anymore. Yeah, a lot of dams. So you guys, you're really into
interest here.
Yeah, you clearly are.
We need to have you come back again.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of